Hi, I'm Sandy O'Sullivan. I'm an Aboriginal person, specifically Wiradjuri. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm really happy to be here and talking to you. It's an amazing unit, and really we're at the stage of the unit where we're starting to do a little bit of disruption. So I'm here on Kabi Kabi land, and I'll be joining you in a few days to go through some of these ideas and to think through some of the readings and the material that you're engaging with. So I'm a professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie. And the work that I do, it explores public representations and Indigenous agency in order to help make better futures for Indigenous peoples. This is the aim. This week, we're going to explore some of the ways that institutional policies in sites of learning have privileged settler knowledge and perspectives, and also the ways in which those policies have really restricted the lives of Indigenous peoples across the continent. But rather than just focusing on that, it's also looking at the ways that that's disrupted. And you would have seen in the readings that I've got, there's actually some moments of talking about that disruption. So I'll just go through those readings a little bit before we get into a little bit more of the kind of meatiness of the idea of sites of learning. So I'm using the term sites of learning not just to describe schools and universities, but also to talk about those public sites in which people learn about, in this case, Indigenous peoples. And hopefully from Indigenous peoples. So you'll see that there's a lens of agency across all three pieces of writing. So I'll start with Rose Barracliff's work. There's a really interesting challenge in this work where what she talks about is that we haven't, this perspective that we, that is Indigenous people in Australia, haven't done enough. This idea that we have more work to do and more information to give and more, and that the lacking in affecting change in everything from archives to museums to the education system to the health system is all about what we haven't quite explained to people. So, and she starts to worry this and says, we're doing this again and again and again. We're explaining ourselves again and again, but actually there's a kind of gaslighting involved when you explain the same thing over and over again, and that same group of people come back and say, but you haven't told us this before. And so she unpacks that, and she talks about the power of really engaging these ideas of what it means to reconcile. So she takes on the R word, reconciliation, which is really a tricky idea, but fundamentally part of what the idea of reconciliation is this idea of reconciling. And to do that, there has to be open dialogue, but there also has to be an even playing field. And so part of what the piece that I've put up that's mine, so I've got two pieces that are mine. One's specifically talking about the ways that self-determination work, Indigenous agencies. It's Practice Futures for Indigenous Agencies, Our Gaps, Our Leaps. So it talks a little bit about the way that that we exceed the gap, and not just that idea of somehow meeting the gap. And who defines the gap? Who decides what that gap is? And it's very easy for us to see it when we talk about outcomes. But so we can talk about health outcomes, we can talk about education outcomes, and then it's measured against non-Indigenous people in this country when we talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander outcomes. But of course, that is a rather simplistic way of doing it. And so part of what I've explored is that in a colonial state, it's very difficult to restate an idea that there is excellence that sits outside of what is valued. So in the education context, if you're not getting schooling at a certain level, a degree, maybe a higher degree, then you're not succeeding in education. And so it unpacks that and starts to think about what education really means, what it means to learn, what it means to understand. Hopefully you're not just here to get a degree. Hopefully you're here and engaged in this to be able to understand and know a little bit more about one another, and to know and to learn, to engage in that idea of learning, finding out something that you didn't know before, and being really excited about how that can transform you, but also how you can use that to transform not just the world, but the work that you do. And so in the case of education, the very, very strong policy framework that's been placed from moment of colonisation through has been imposed largely onto everybody, whether it's Indigenous or non-Indigenous people, in a way that isn't particularly responsive. In the first instance, it was obviously about bringing these ideas of education through to, to this colonised land, and this notion of edifying and educating a population was about that population becoming a simulacrum, a version of those within the colonial state. And so it's problematic in its inception, but it continues to be problematic as we move forward, because it becomes a behemoth that is absolutely difficult to change. It's difficult for us to articulate why it's problematic, all of us. And for Indigenous people specifically, it's difficult to graft onto that ideas of what it means to be Indigenous, what we want to learn, how we learn, what we value. All of those ideas become lost because they're not what's valued. And so the disruptions become incredibly important. And Rose, in her piece, talks about the importance of those disruptions, and I do too. And those disruptions can be really positive disruptions, and you can see that I talk about those positive disruptions. Similarly, in the museums piece, that third blog piece that's there for the Australian Museum, it's such an important idea that museums will be able to create a site that explores the way that we can be in the world, the way that we can be better, the way that we can better understand and listen to and engage with all communities. So I came out of a process of working in museums. For about the last 10 or 12 years, I've been working on and working towards a project that looked at engagement and representation in First Nations museums. So I was very interested in this idea that we might be able to represent ourselves better than we have before. But a really fundamental part of that project was recognising that we saw these sites, and the we in this, remember, we is explored through all these readings as you've read this. That term we is unpacked a whole lot. And I think that's incredibly important, especially in the Yolngu video. That's a really interesting, the video on Yolngu mathematics, that's a really interesting disruption of we that's explored there. But part of what we need to do as we go through this is to really understand how the disruption within museum space might be able to recalibrate the relationship. Look, fundamentally, museums were really dangerous places for First Nations peoples. First Nations peoples were collected, our bodies were collected into museums. They were gathered post-mortem and taken from community, which has its own rich and storied problems, that bodies were taken away, but also the idea of the commodification of bodies as a commodity. really tricky, right? So the museum is this horror site for a lot of First Nations peoples. And so I just became interested in how we could turn it into something else, because we all deserve, whether we're Indigenous or not, we all deserve to be represented and treated with respect within any of these sites of learning. Our stories need to be respected. Actually, they need to be valued. They need to help us form the story of who we are. We can't just be spoken about. We can't just be described. It needs to be agentic. And so when you look at something like the disruption that you see in the Yolngu Mathematics video, you actually see, and that project in total, and of course the work that Yolngu people have been doing for thousands of years, you see that this is about it making sense. It's about not a grafting onto a system where it completely doesn't make sense. It's about bringing in something that will edify, build, and will grow the idea of how we all work together. And so the idea of agency and having agency is often disrupted by the structures and the policies that are formed. And again, that idea of closing the gap is about the idea that this is where non-Indigenous people are at in the country. This is where there is a desire for Indigenous people to be, maybe here. But actually there is no means to talk about what happens when Indigenous people are exceeding a gap, because everything is about the gap deficit. Everything is about what we don't have. Everything is about getting people to a level playing field, as though the playing field was designed by us, as though the playing field works in that way, and that the rules are known and that the rules are the same for everyone. And so, not to get into too much of this idea of a lack of genuine agency, it goes beyond that into how we form disruptions of this. And so we're able to do that in multiple ways, but one of them is recognising when there isn't representation and calling it out. So you will have read a little bit, Rose has talked about in her piece symbolic annihilation. I work on a project called Challenging Symbolic Annihilation, but we both unpack this idea of symbolic annihilation in a really, I hope, useful way, because I want you as an individual to think about whether you've ever seen yourself represented in TV or in a movie. And I don't mean that you make a journey towards a character. I mean, have you seen somebody who is exactly like you? Have you seen that? Have you seen them behave in ways that you would behave? Now, for a lot of people, the answer is no. Actually, a lot of people. But for Aboriginal people, it's actually an emphatic no in a lot of instances. This idea of us just not being there and not being represented, and our truth not being represented. Certainly growing up, I saw, I'm in my mid-50s, I saw a lot of representations of Aboriginal people that were negative. I saw a lot of representations that were romanticised, and I saw these ideas of what it was to be an Indigenous person that actually didn't reflect who I am. And I wouldn't say that even now I see that very often. And this isn't about me. This is about everyone. This is about the idea of us being able to see people who are like us and being able to understand that that is a way to be in the world. Now, policy and institutional restrictions and constrictions actually inform that. They reduce. So a museum, you walk into a museum and you can only see some stories. And so what's happened traditionally is that there's a lot of, you go into a museum and you'll see a chronology, so it'll be a timeline of beginning, so before time, people arrive, then it goes through stages, and you're seeing a very specific kind of person. It becomes this kind of representative of the group. And that representative is almost never representative. It's representative of one person within that group, and then often not either, because they're not well-rounded. They're reduced to something that an audience can understand. What we're starting to see in disruptions in museums is also what we're starting to see in disruptions in other sites of learning, specifically the education system, which is a recognition that sometimes stories can help us see the diversity. It can help us see that policies that restrict and constrict and that narrow actually don't provide that much engagement. They don't provide that much representation. And they also, really importantly, don't really inform anyone. You don't go away with what I hope we go away with after we've had a discussion about this, which is to go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And I think that's the most important aspect of this. I challenge, you will have read that I challenge the idea of settler, the idea of settlement. It's a very passive term. And I'm not just talking about in the act of colonisation or invasion. I'm talking about that idea of settlement as, you settle into a couch. You're comfortable. You're not really disrupting. You're not really trying to expand or think of new ways to do something. You're actually there to decompress and to settle. It's a very problematic term to be used, in my opinion, in contrast to the idea of Indigenous agency. So that the idea of settler is we're settled, off you go. So and that's not where a lot of people who would consider themselves settlers are at. For a lot of people, it's about the tension, positive tension, of building relationships between the settler colonial space and what Indigenous people want. But of course, that also always becomes a kind of graft when it comes to institutional spaces. So education, for all that we really attempt to disrupt it, and we obviously have a responsibility to do that as Indigenous educators. It's really important that we introduce those disruptions, but we do it still within a system that is a colonial system and a set of restrictions that still ape what is happening in Europe, for instance. So it still has a kind of European flavour to the shape of it. How does that get disrupted further? And by the way, I'll ask a whole bunch of questions and then genuinely not answer any of them, because I don't think there are easy answers. I think when we open up, reduced is easy to come up with answers. It's easy to show a representation of a person if you know exactly what they're going to look like. But if they can look like anything, then actually that's really hard. But actually it's not, because again, it's the stories that we can tell that help us better understand this. And so hearing what Indigenous people's aspirations are around education is a disruptor. Now, obviously throughout that, there are some major issues with the structure and formal processes involved in particularly schooling and higher education. That is a choice. It's a choice that's made by government. It's a choice that's made by educators to some extent. They're also restricted within what they can do. And so part of what we need to explore, and what we'll talk about more, is how we can push those disruptions. What can we do to make that work better? So I also don't use the term decolonising. I use the term anti-colonial. I don't think you can decolonise something that is a colonial structure. I think it's like building up this structure and taking out a block. I think it falls over. And I think anti-colonial work points to it. It says, look, no, that isn't working. It's not working for anyone. We live in a continent that is not Europe. The seasons are around the other way, and actually the seasons are different. So the whole notion of grabbing a set of ideas that works in that context and recasting them here is a load of nonsense. You know, it is problematic. And again, when you look at everything from Chris Sara's very specific way of working towards excellence and assuming excellence in Aboriginal students, through to ideas of Yolngu mathematics actually making sense, and this not being some system that is disconnected from social engagement, from society, from meaning making, is a really, really important part of that. So the way that we do the anti-colonial work is to certainly pull apart those concepts in our minds. You know, we need to challenge all these representations that don't represent us. You know, why would we be upholding institutions that have historically damaged us? So why do I work in museums? Why do I do anything in a social history museum or a natural history museum? Why do I work with the Australian Museum? You know, and the answer is really simple. They have a responsibility to us to change, to also do that anti-colonial work. And I'm really happy to report that in the case of education and also in the case of those kinds of spaces like museums and public sites, there is a move to change. You know, and I'm not just talking about very clear disruptions like statues being brought down. Obviously, that happens for important reasons, and you know, you might read some material on that in answer to some of the questions that come up this week. But my fundamental is always, what do we need to do to make this a more comfortable space for people to learn? And also in terms of the content, how do we understand that the content that we're trying to promote actually probably isn't working? It probably isn't as helpful or edifying as we think. And if we start from that point, how do we make it better? One of the reasons that we focus on future and future studies in the work that we do in the department is because we want to edify, we want to build something, we want to build towards a future. This isn't just, again, about closing the gap. Of course it's about closing the gap. It's about exceeding the gap. It's about recognising that. And it's important to ask a fundamental question. Why is exceeding the gap not something that we talk about? Why aren't we talking about Aboriginal excellence? Why aren't we talking about ways that we might be doing better than the rest of the population? And part of the reason is I think it seems as though it is strangely competitive. I think it seems as though it is only disruptive. But my argument would be that, one, it's not a competition, two, disruptive is the only way that we're ever going to do this. So disruption is the work that we all need to do. If you want greater agency for Indigenous people in Australia, I'd say work on that disruption. You know, work on disrupting your own beliefs and ideas. As an Aboriginal person, I do that. You know, I don't rest on the idea that I just magically know stuff. I not only obviously read a lot about what people are thinking, but also I talk within my community, but I also ask questions, but I do a more fundamental thing, and that's that I listen. And listening is an important part of that. And that's why museums matter in this space. You know, it's there's a bit of a jokey thing that happened as a part of the museum study, and I was talking to a curator not included in the study about, must have been about 8 years ago now. And they were asking me about other things, and then out of the blue they said, do you think there'll still be Indigenous people in 100 years' time? I was gobsmacked. It was a really shocking thing for someone to say. And actually, there was another person from Australia who was there, a non-Indigenous person who was there, and this was in London, I should say, who looked shocked. And one of the things that occurred to me immediately in response to it was, I was there in a museum. I was there looking at representations of First Nations peoples in that space. And I said, look, of course there'll still be Indigenous people in 100 years' time, but I'm not sure about museums. And, I've probably trotted this out as a story a few times, so you might have heard this before, but, she really did look like I'd just shot her entire family. I mean, the whole thing was this kind of how could museums not exist? I mean, not concerned about Indigenous people not existing, but concerned about museums not existing. The trust and faith and idea that a system can't change is fundamentally the problem. And it does inform the way that policy works. So you'll see that Rose Barraclough talks about this in that whole idea of how we engage, how we try and change the system, try and inform the system, and also how we connect to one another. I think in talking about the people who are doing this really edifying work in my piece, it's a really important part of the story. And we've got to get that out to one another. We've got to share those positive stories of disruption, positive stories of things not working. It is actually possible to do that. And I really, really, really urge you to consider that as you're reading through all of this material. So we'll catch up next week. I have some more material that I'll be presenting later about queer community, queer Indigenous communities globally. And there is increasingly a lot of material on that process of how policy is formed. So just thinking about this week and then even connecting it into that future period, that idea of how policy restricts, constricts, and informs is really important. You can read any policy. I'm not going to put up a policy for you to read. Literally read any policy that's around a site of learning, and you will see some of those disruptions. I'm incredibly proud to say that it was Leanne Holt, who was our PVC Indigenous, Pro-Vice Chancellor Indigenous at Macquarie, who helmed the Universities Australia Indigenous Strategy that actually sets a roadmap for how we affect change in universities. We know that is about having really difficult conversations and not shying away from them and trying to think of ways that we can expand and extend. So that carries across this entire unit, but it also carries across our next set of discussions around queer people and what that means in the context of Indigenous Australia. So thank you very much. I will